was a bright, sunny afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oak Ridge. The local park, a sprawling expanse of green nestled between rows of picturesque houses, was alive with the sounds of laughter and play. Children ran across the grass, their joyful shrieks echoing through the trees, while parents lounged on benches or picnicked under the shade of tall oaks. The scene was almost idyllic, the kind of day that made Oak Ridge feel like the perfect place to raise a family. Karen Turner, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, strolled through the park with a sense of routine satisfaction. A woman in her mid-40s with neatly styled blonde hair and a crisp white blouse, Karen prided herself on being a vigilant member of the community. She knew nearly everyone who frequented the park, from the joggers who lapped the trails every morning to the families who played on the weekends. In many ways, she felt a sense of ownership over the space, a responsibility to keep it safe and orderly. As Karen walked down the familiar path, something caught her eye: a family setting up a picnic on the far side of the park near the playground. There was nothing unusual about a family enjoying the park on a day like this, but something about this particular group drew Karen's attention. She noticed the father first, a tall black man in his late 30s, laughing as he spread a blanket on the grass. His wife, a striking woman with natural curls and an easy smile, was unpacking a basket while their two children, a boy and a girl, chased each other around the blanket. Karen paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed them. She didn't recognize them, which was odd because she knew almost everyone in the neighborhood. They were clearly enjoying themselves, but a small voice in her mind whispered that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the fact that they were new, or perhaps it was something else, an unease she couldn't quite put her finger on. She stood there for a moment, watching as the father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders, her delighted squeal cutting through the air. The mother, noticing Karen's gaze, waved politely. Karen forced a smile and waved back, but the unease lingered. She continued her walk, but her mind kept returning to the family. Were they visitors, new to the area, or just passing through? As she circled back toward the playground, Karen noticed a few familiar faces. Mrs. Jenkins, a retiree who often walked her dog in the park, and the Martins, a young couple with a toddler. She approached Mrs. Jenkins, who was sitting on a bench, knitting. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Karen remarked, taking a seat beside her. "Oh yes, perfect weather," Mrs. Jenkins replied, not looking up from her knitting. Karen hesitated, then nodded toward the family. "Do you know them, the ones with the picnic?" Mrs. Jenkins glanced up briefly, squinting in the direction of the family. "No, can't say I do. They must be new around here." Karen muttered, more to herself than to Mrs. Jenkins. "I just don't remember seeing them before." Mrs. Jenkins shrugged, uninterested. "People come and go, Karen. It's a park, after all." Karen nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She stood up, excusing herself, and continued her walk, but instead of relaxing, she found herself growing more anxious with each step. The family seemed happy, but what if they weren't just a normal family enjoying the park? What if they had other intentions? The park had always been a safe space, and Karen didn't want anything to disrupt that peace. By the time she reached the other side of the park, Karen had convinced herself that it wouldn't hurt to be cautious. She pulled out her phone and called her friend Lisa, who lived a few blocks away and was also part of the neighborhood watch. "Hey, Lisa, are you busy?" Karen asked when Lisa picked up. "Not really. What's up?" "Well, I'm at the park and there's this family here. I've never seen them before. They're having a picnic, but I just got a weird vibe, you know?" Lisa was silent for a moment. "A weird vibe? What do you mean?" Karen sighed. "I don't know. They just seem out of place." "I mean, who has a picnic in the middle of the day like this? And they're not from around here, I'm sure of it." Lisa chuckled lightly. "Karen, it's a public park. People come here all the time. Maybe they're just visiting." "Maybe," Karen agreed, but the unease didn't fade. But what if they're not? What if they're here for, I don't know, something else? Lisa sighed. "Karen, you're overthinking this. Just let it go." Karen nodded, though Lisa couldn't see her. "Yeah, you're probably right. I'm just being paranoid." But even after she hung up, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced back at the family, now seated and eating their lunch. The father was telling a story, animated and full of life, while the children giggled and the mother watched with a warm smile. Karen's heart pounded as she debated what to do. Finally, she made a decision. It was probably nothing, she told herself, but it was better to be safe than sorry. She opened her phone again, this time dialing 911. 911, what's your emergency? Karen's voice wavered slightly as she spoke. "Hi, I'm at Oak Ridge Park and there's a family here that's acting suspiciously. They don't seem to belong here and I just think someone should check it out." The operator asked for more details, and Karen provided a description of the family, trying to keep her voice steady. When the call ended, she felt a mix of relief and guilt wash over her. Surely she was just being cautious, protecting her community. The police would come, check things out, and if everything was fine, then no harm done. She walked back to a bench near the playground, her eyes fixed on the family as she waited. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of sirens approaching, and her heart began to race. This was it. She was about to find out if her instincts were right or if she had made a terrible mistake. Karen sat on the bench, her hands clasped tightly together as the sound of sirens grew louder. She tried to appear calm, but her heart was racing and her thoughts were a jumble of uncertainty. What if she was wrong? What if she had misjudged the situation entirely? But then again, what if she was right? The safety of the neighborhood was at stake, and she couldn't ignore that. As the first police car pulled up to the edge of the park, Karen felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Two officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they scanned the area. Karen stood up, waving them over. They approached her quickly, one of them, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, leading the way. "Ma'am, are you the one who called?" he asked, his voice steady but authoritative. "Yes, that was me," Karen replied, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "There's a family over there," she gestured toward the picnic area, where the black family was still sitting, oblivious to the unfolding drama. "We recognized them and they've been acting suspiciously." The officer glanced in the direction she pointed. "Suspiciously how?" Karen hesitated. The family didn't seem to be doing anything out of the ordinary, but the uneasy feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. The officer's gaze flickered toward the picnic area where the black family continued their meal, unaware of the scrutiny they were under. He turned back to Karen, his expression neutral but firm. "Ma'am, you said they were acting suspiciously. Can you clarify what exactly they were doing?" Karen hesitated, suddenly unsure of how to articulate the vague discomfort she felt. I don't know them, and they don't look like they live around here," she admitted, shifting her weight uncomfortably. "They've been here for a while, and I just thought it was unusual." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a shorter woman with a patient but professional demeanor. "Ma'am, being unfamiliar in a neighborhood isn't a crime," the female officer said gently. "Unless they're causing a disturbance, there's no reason for police intervention." Karen felt her face heat up, realizing how flimsy her reasoning sounded now that she had to say it out loud. She folded her arms. "I just thought you should check." The male officer nodded. "We'll take a look, but please stay here." As the officers approached the family, Karen watched from her bench, her heart pounding. The father noticed the officers first. He sat up a little straighter, glancing at his wife, who instinctively pulled her children closer. The officers introduced themselves, speaking in calm, measured tones. Karen strained to hear, but she couldn't make out their words. After a few moments, the father pulled a wallet from his pocket and handed the officers what seemed to be an ID. The mother was speaking now, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. The children sat frozen, their happy picnic turned into an unexpected moment of uncertainty. Karen shifted in her seat. What had she done? They weren't doing anything wrong. They were just there, enjoying the park like everyone else, and now she had brought the police to them, forcing them to prove that they belonged. One of the officers turned back toward her. He gave a small nod to his partner before heading back in Karen's direction. The female officer remained, still speaking with the family. "Ma'am," the officer said as he reached her, "they're a local family. They moved into the neighborhood a few months ago." Karen blinked. "Oh, I didn't know." "That's understandable, but you should also know that there's nothing suspicious about them having a picnic with their kids," he continued, his tone still professional, but carrying an edge of subtle disapproval. Karen swallowed hard. I wanted to make sure everything was okay. Next time, if you're concerned about new faces in the neighborhood, maybe start with a friendly introduction instead of a 911 call." Karen felt the weight of his words settle deep in her chest. She nodded, unable to form a proper response. As the officer turned and rejoined his partner, Karen watched as they exchanged a few more words with the family before leaving. The father shook his head slightly and reached for his daughter's hand. The mother wrapped an arm around her son, offering him a reassuring squeeze. Karen remained on the bench, feeling an unfamiliar mixture of embarrassment and regret. She had wanted to protect her neighborhood, to ensure its safety, but now, as she watched the family pack up their picnic, their smiles replaced with unease, she wondered if she had done the exact opposite. She had been so sure that something was wrong, but now it was clear She had been the problem. Karen sat on the bench for a long time after the officers left. She watched the family as they finished packing up their belongings, the air around them now filled with an uncomfortable tension. The children, once full of laughter, were now quiet, glancing nervously at their parents. The father's shoulders were tense, his eyes scanning the park as if assessing whether they were still being watched. The mother gave him a reassuring pat on the arm, but Karen could tell that the moment had soured their peaceful outing. For the first time, Karen felt an overwhelming sense of shame. She had thought she was doing the right thing, looking out for her community, but now it felt like she had done something else entirely. She had made a family feel unwelcome in what should have been a shared space. Taking a deep breath, she stood up and slowly walked toward them. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached, uncertain of what she would even say. Would they be angry? Would they yell at her? Would they ignore her completely? She wasn't sure which outcome would be worse. Her father noticed her first. His expression was guarded, but he didn't turn away. The mother standing beside him shifted her weight as if bracing for another confrontation. Karen cleared her throat. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I shouldn't have called the police. I didn't think. The mother glanced at her husband before responding. No, you didn't, she said, her voice calm but firm. You didn't think about how that would feel for us. Karen swallowed hard, nodding. I know, and I know I can't take it back. I guess I was being overprotective. The father let out a slow breath. Protecting who? From what? We were just having a picnic with our kids. Karen looked down at her hands, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. I realize now that I was wrong. I let my assumptions get in the way of common sense. There was a long pause before the mother sighed. We moved here because we wanted a safe place to raise our kids, just like you. But today you made us feel like we don't belong. Karen's eyes stung. I don't want you to feel that way. I don't know how to make it right, but I am sorry. The father exchanged another look with his wife, and for a moment Karen thought they wouldn't say anything else. But then he nodded. Acknowledging it is a start. But next time, try talking to people before assuming the worst. Karen nodded quickly. I will. The family gathered their things and started walking toward the parking lot. Karen watched them go, her stomach twisting with guilt. She had learned something today, something she should have already known. The neighborhood wasn't just hers to protect. It belonged to everyone who called it home. Karen sat on the bench long after the family had left the park, staring at the empty picnic spot where they had been. The warmth of the afternoon sun did little to ease the chill settling in her chest. She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who looked out for her neighborhood, someone who cared. But now, for the first time, she had to confront the possibility that her version of caring had caused harm. The walk home felt heavier than usual. Each step dragged, her mind replaying the day's events. She had called the police on a family, parents with children, simply because they were unfamiliar to her. That realization gnawed at her, forcing her to acknowledge the discomfort she had long avoided. When she reached her front door, she hesitated before going inside. Her husband, Greg, was in the living room reading, a cup of coffee in his hand. He glanced up as she entered, immediately noticing the troubled look on her face. Everything okay? He asked, setting his coffee down. Karen exhaled slowly, then shook her head. No, not really. Greg frowned, concern edged across his face. What happened? She hesitated before sinking into the couch beside him. I did something today. Something I regret. Greg put his book aside and turned toward her. Talk to me. Karen wrung her hands together, unsure of how to even begin. There was a family at the park, a black family. I didn't recognize them, and I thought something was off, so I called the police. Greg's expression shifted, a mixture of surprise and something else. Disappointment? Karen felt her chest tighten. You called the police? On a family having a picnic? He repeated slowly, as if trying to make sense of it. Karen nodded, shame washing over her. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was looking out for the neighborhood. But the police talked to them, and it turns out they live here, they weren't doing anything wrong, and now I can't stop thinking about how I made them feel. Greg sighed and rubbed his chin. Karen, do you understand why that's a problem? I do now, she admitted, but I didn't in the moment. I just felt uneasy, and instead of walking over and introducing myself, I made an assumption. I called the police, and now that family probably feels like they don't belong. Greg nodded, choosing his words carefully. People always say they're not racist, that they don't have biases, but the truth is we all have blind spots. The difference is whether we acknowledge them and do better. Karen swallowed the lump in her throat. I want to do better. I need to. Greg reached over and squeezed her hand. Then start by making it right. Karen thought about that for a long time. That night, she barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities. How could she make it right? Would an apology be enough? Would they even want to hear from her? By morning, she had made a decision. She owed them more than just regret. She needed to take responsibility. Later that afternoon, Karen stood in front of a neat brick house just a few blocks away from her own. She had done some asking around and confirmed that the family had moved in a few months ago. Their home was warm and welcoming, with colorful flower beds lining the front yard and a child's bicycle propped against the porch steps. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the door. She had never felt this nervous meeting a new neighbor before. A few moments later, the door opened. The mother stood there, wearing a casual sweater and jeans, her expression unreadable as she recognized Karen. Hi, Karen started, her voice softer than usual. I don't know if you remember me from the park yesterday. The woman crossed her arms. I remember. Karen nodded, taking a deep breath. I just wanted to come by and apologize. I shouldn't have called the police. I should have introduced myself. I should have welcomed you instead of making you feel like you didn't belong. The woman studied her for a moment, then sighed. It wasn't just the police showing up, It was what it represented. We moved here thinking it was a good place to raise our kids, and then, in one afternoon, we were reminded that some people still see us as outsiders. That's a hard thing to explain to your children. Karen's stomach twisted. I can't undo that, but I can promise to do better, and I can start by saying, welcome to the neighborhood. The mother held her gaze for a long time before finally nodding. Thank you. That means something. Karen exhaled in relief. Would you be open to having coffee sometime? I'd really like to get to know you. The woman smiled, albeit cautiously. Maybe. Give it some time, Karen nodded. I understand. As she walked back home, she realized that change wouldn't happen overnight. But it had to start somewhere, and for her, it started with listening, learning, and choosing to be better. The days that followed were quiet, but the weight of Karen's actions stayed with her. She had always considered herself a good neighbor, someone who looked out for the well-being of the community. But now she realized that being a good neighbor wasn't just about keeping things in order. It was about making sure everyone felt like they belonged. She thought about the family often, wondering if they were still uncomfortable in their new home, if they were still wary of people like her. She wanted to fix it, but she knew that one apology wouldn't erase what had happened. One morning, while walking through the neighborhood, she spotted the mother from the park outside her house tending to her garden. Karen hesitated, then took a deep breath and approached. Good morning, she said, her voice tentative. The woman looked up, her expression unreadable. Morning, Karen gestured toward the flowers. Your garden looks beautiful. I've always struggled to keep mine alive. The woman eyed her for a moment before responding. It takes patience and knowing when to step back and let things grow. Karen nodded, catching the meaning behind the words. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I don't expect things to be fixed overnight, but I want to do better. The woman sighed, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. When we moved here, we just wanted what any family wants, a safe home, good schools for our kids, a place where we didn't have to prove we belonged. But that day in the park, it reminded us that to some people, we'll always be new, always be outsiders first. Karen's stomach twisted. I hate that I made you feel that way. It was never my intention. The woman studied her before finally speaking. I believe you, but the impact matters more than the intent. Karen nodded. You're right, and that's why I'm trying to change. There was a long pause before the woman gave a small, thoughtful smile. Well, change has to start somewhere. Karen exhaled, feeling a tiny weight lift from her chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. Would you and your family like to come over for dinner sometime? Karen asked. I'd love to get to know you all better. The woman tilted her head, considering the offer. Maybe. Let's take it one step at a time, Karen smiled. That sounds fair. As she walked back home, she realized that real change wasn't about grand gestures. It was about small, meaningful steps toward understanding. She had made a mistake, but she was ready to grow from it. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better for all of them.